Carrie. I am one of the pastors here at One Life, and I just want to thank you for being here today just to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus with us. Today, we remember that the stone is rolled away, the tomb is still empty, Jesus is alive, and death doesn't get the final word. Easter is a day of good news. It's a day to celebrate. But if you'll allow me for the next few minutes, I kind of want to press rewind on the story for just a moment. Because in the midst of the horror of the crucifixion and the utter joy of the resurrection, there's a guy, there's a disciple of Jesus who is having the worst moment of his life. This guy has done something so out of character, something he promised he would never, ever do, something he's not sure he can come back from. This guy has failed in the worst possible way. And not privately. No. This man is going to have the lowest point of his life recorded by every gospel writer. And it's going to be known by billions of people for thousands of years. I'm talking, of course, about Peter. And before we get to the empty tomb, we need to pull up a spot by a fire about 48 hours earlier. Peter was one of Jesus' closest disciples and friends. Peter walked with Jesus for 3 years at this point, learning from him, witnessing miracles he never imagined he would see. Peter was the first of the disciples to confess Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of God. And he received his nickname, the Rock, as a result of that great confession. But now, everything Peter thought he knew seemed to be coming undone. Earlier in the night, his teacher and his Lord told Peter something that may have turned his stomach to knots and caused his heart to race. Jesus told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I've risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." And Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." "Truly, I tell you," Jesus answered, "this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same. But now here he stood, just him and John, around a fire outside the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. Jesus had just been taken inside to be interrogated after his arrest in the garden. And just like Jesus predicted, every other disciple but those 2 had scattered and were presumably hiding somewhere. Peter may have thought back to Jesus' arrest and just how utterly confusing it was. He had tried to fight. He tried to protect Jesus. He even got a good swipe at one of the high priest's servants. But Jesus stopped him and rebuked him. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." And then Jesus did the most confusing thing of all. He healed the man who had come to arrest him, just like he'd healed so many others. But none of those others were part of a mob armed with swords and torches. And after that, he willingly went with them as they found the Messiah of God. They led him away, mocking him and striking him and spitting on him as they went. But Peter stuck to his word. Even though almost all his friends ran away, Peter wasn't going to do that. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside the door. John, he was the other disciple that followed, knew the high priest somehow and was welcomed in. But that invitation didn't extend to Peter, and the door slammed in his face. The other disciple who was known to the high priest came back and spoke to the servant girl who was on duty there and brought Peter in. John, who was always looking out for him, came out, vouched for Peter, and the servant girl opened the door. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. And he replied, "I'm not." Why did he say that? Did he think that if he said that he was, it would be too suspicious? Maybe he was afraid the word got out about what he did to that servant's ear. If they knew who he was, they would never let him in. So he lied just the once, just to get through that door. Now it was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing there with him, warming himself. When Peter walked through that courtyard, he joined a group of people crowding around a fire to keep warm on that chilly spring night. And he recognized some faces, most of them unfriendly, and they seemed to recognize him too. And here's where things get a little tricky because it seems like the accusations are just flying at Peter from all directions. And the order in which everything happens gets a little fuzzy. Things get a little chaotic. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" And then he went out of the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "Well, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." And a little later, someone else saw him and said, "Well, you're also one of them." Over and over, people just kept pushing on him. Now, I don't know what Peter expected when he went to that fire, but it wasn't this. Peter wasn't just afraid now, he was disoriented. The story he thought he had been part of for so long was just turned on its head. And when that happens, it's really hard to know what to do next. But he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Now that seemed to calm the tension for about an hour. But then a new group of people joined the growing crowd waiting outside the high priest's house. After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Well, surely you're one of them. Your accent gives you away." They knew he was a Galilean, just like Jesus, just like John, just like most of the other disciples. Peter starts to feel this pressure building inside him. And then someone who couldn't deny knowing him spoke. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" This man had seen him. In the garden, he saw what Peter did to his relative. He knew exactly who Peter was. What if he calls the guards? What if they come to arrest him? He was just trying to protect Jesus, and now he's at risk of winding up on a cross too. That pressure that's been building finally breaks. Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." And the type of curses that he used were words that no one should ever speak. They weren't meant just to distance, but completely disown. They were not just denial, they were damnation. These were the most vile words that had ever come out of Peter's mouth. And they were about a man he had been first to call his Savior. And as Peter called down these horrible words, he didn't notice the doors to the high priest's chambers open. He didn't notice the guards pulling the bound and bloodied Jesus through that door. But just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. And the sound stopped him. And he finally looks, and he realizes Jesus heard every word he just said. And the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Peter had promised Jesus that he would rather die than deny him. But he just denied him to preserve his own life. Peter had let fear and misaligned expectations and self-preservation win. Jesus said it was going to happen. You can almost hear Peter's thought. He must be so disappointed in me. Those words couldn't be unsaid. There's no way Peter could ever undo this. And as Jesus is led away, Peter runs in the other direction. And he went outside and wept bitterly. So let me ask you this. What does God do with someone in that moment? Have you ever had a moment where you felt like you couldn't come back from something you said or something you did? I want to give you just a couple minutes. Process this. Talk to the people beside you, the people you came with. What's stirring in your heart right now as you think about this question?
So Carrie did a fantastic job narrating Peter's failure. Not just what he did, but also why he did what he did. And I'm sure that all of us can resonate with some part of Peter's failure. I know that I can. We've all had times when we have been motivated by our fear, by self-preservation, or by misaligned expectations. But I don't want today just to be about Peter's biggest mistake, his epic mistake. Because more than anything today, Easter, is not about just Peter's mistake, but about Jesus' response to that mistake. Here's the big idea that I don't want you to miss, that I want you to carry with you when you leave here. When you make a mistake, because you will, God is not disappointed in you. Instead, God moves toward you. Let me say that again. When you make a mistake, when you sin, when you fail, God is not disappointed in you. Instead, God moves toward you. Now, what does the word disappointment mean? It means to be dissatisfied or displeased with something or someone, a circumstance or a situation. This week I came across this formula. It is expectation minus reality equals disappointment. As human beings, disappointment occurs when reality does not meet our expectations. And it is a very, very, very normal human experience. When we have expectations and a situation, a circumstance, a relationship, the reality comes in underneath that expectation, that space between, that's filled with disappointment. But the question is this: does God experience this when we don't live up to the expectations that he has for us. And God does have some expectations for us. God expects for us that we would be transformed into the likeness of Jesus. That's an expectation. He expects that our lives would produce the fruits of the Spirit. He expects that we would love him and love our neighbors above all else. He expects that we would be holy as he is holy, as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. Another way to say that would be that we would be different than the world around us, that we would be set apart. Those are some of God's expectations for you and for me. And we all know that we don't always live up to those expectations. So our reality doesn't match God's expectation. And what happens when our reality does not match God's expectation? What fills the space between our reality and God's expectations of us? Well, let's look at how Jesus responds to Peter. I want to show you two ways that we know Jesus actually responded to Peter. The first is after the resurrection, there's this fascinating moment that's actually recorded later in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul is proclaiming the good news of Jesus' work on the cross and the empty tomb. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 5, that Jesus appeared to Peter and then to the 12. Did you catch it? Who did he appear to first? Peter. He appeared to Peter before he appeared to the other disciples. Jesus appeared to the one who failed the loudest before he appeared to the other disciples. Peter, the one who denied Jesus 3 times, gets a one-on-one moment. Jesus doesn't wait for Peter to come to him. Instead, he goes and finds Peter. He appears to him. He reveals himself to him. Jesus goes to Peter personally. You know, oftentimes we can create narratives about who God is and how God responds to us. We create these narratives in our head. Some of us, they've been given to us over time. And oftentimes those narratives that we've created in our head or that have been given to us, they are worst case scenario. This is how God is going to respond. We say things like, if I go to church, God's going to strike me with lightning. That is a worst case scenario, isn't it? And oftentimes, those narratives that we've created in our head or have been given to us, they're not true. They're a lie. But here is the truth. And don't miss this. In the midst of Peter's worst moment, Jesus moved closer to him. That's how we see Jesus respond to sin, to failure, and to mistakes. And because we know that Jesus shows us perfectly what God is like, then we know that's exactly how God responds when we don't live up to his expectations. The second time that Jesus responds to Peter is found in John chapter 21. Peter has gone back to his old job of fishing. It says in John 21, verse 3, Simon says, I'm going out fishing. And the other boys said, we'll come with you. So they went out, they got in the boat, and they fished all night. But that night they caught nothing. Now these were professional fishermen before Jesus called them to follow him. And now they really stink at this job. They caught nothing. John's record, he wrote this down, his record of Peter going out fishing, it wasn't just about a job. John is writing this in John 21 because it's an example of how Peter is running away from God. It's Peter's way of saying, I blew it. I disqualified myself. I'm going back to my old life prior to Jesus. And while Peter and the other boys are out on the water in the boat, fishing, doing that old life stuff, Jesus meets Peter right where he's at. John 21, verse 4 says that Jesus showed up on the shore. And in verse 9, it tells us that Jesus was on the shore, and I love this part, cooking breakfast. There's not a lecture. There's not a hellfire and brimstone sermon. Jesus isn't yelling a sermon, spitting all over the place. There's no finger wagging. There's no cold shoulder. There's just a meal. There's a table. Jesus sets a table in order to remind Peter, Peter, you still belong here. There's still a seat at the table for you. So, this is what we know to be true when we look at Jesus' response to Peter's failures. Jesus shows us that when we fail, when we make mistakes, when we sin, because we will, God is not disappointed in us, but rather he moves toward us. Now hang with me, okay? Hang with me, because the story in John 21 doesn't end with Jesus standing on the shore. It actually answers a very important question. How do we respond when Jesus moves toward us in the midst of our failures? So let's read John 21, verses 4 through 7. It says, at dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, friends, have you caught any fish? Which I think is a hilarious line, because he knew, you boys, you're not very good at this. And they're like, no. So he says, throw your net on the right-hand side of the boat, which I think they have to be annoyed with, this suggestion. Don't you think they've tried that at some point? And he's like, you'll get some fish. So they did. And they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in the net. Verse 7. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, here it is, don't miss it. He put on his tunic, for he had stripped down for work. He jumped into the water and he started to swim for shore. See, when Jesus moves toward Peter, Peter doesn't run away. He doesn't hide. He jumps into the water and swims straight for him. Peter is discovering a life-changing truth that I hope you will hold on to today. Jesus isn't moving away from him. Jesus is moving toward him. You know, this flips how many of us normally think about God in the midst of our failures. A lot of us assume if I mess up, God pulls back. If I fail, God is frustrated. If I fall short, God is disappointed. But that is not what we see in the person of Jesus. What we see is this, that God moves toward the sinner. Not after they fix themselves up, not after they clean it up, not after they promise to do better, but right in the middle of it. Paul says it like this in Romans 5:8, that God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. When we failed to live up to God's expectations, God loved us and came to us in and through the person of Jesus. When you make a mistake, God moves toward you, not away from you. And here's why that matters. Because what you believe God feels about you in your worst moment actually determines how you will respond to him. Let me say that again. What you believe God feels about you in your worst moment, in your most shadowed moment, in your lowest moment, what you believe God feels about you in that moment will determine how you are going to respond to him. If you think that God is disappointed, you're going to hide. You're going to avoid. You're going to run away. You're going to distance yourself. But if you believe that God is kind, you'll actually move toward him. This is exactly what the scriptures say in Romans chapter 2, verse 4. Listen to this. Don't you see how wonderfully kind, tolerant, and patient God is with you? It's his kindness that leads us to repentance. See, we were running away from God. That's what Peter was doing, running away from Jesus, running back to his old life. And Jesus, showing us what God is like, in his kindness, shows up on the shore, cooks breakfast, sets a table for him, and it's that kindness of Jesus that turns Peter back towards him, and he begins to move back toward Jesus. It's not the disappointment of God that changes you, my friends. It's the kindness of God. Peter isn't transformed because he's shamed. He's transformed because he's welcomed. Because Jesus looks him right in the eye, knowing everything that he had ever done, and still says, "Sit down, my friend. Eat. You're still mine." This is the good news of Easter. The empty grave is proof that sin has been defeated. It's proof that when we do sin, because we will, God does not distance himself, but rather he overcomes the sin and he offers us new life. He offers you another chance. The empty grave is the good news that your failure, it doesn't have the final word, but instead, Jesus is still writing your story.